All right. So first, I would like to acknowledge the land which I'm on today. I'm located in Toronto, the traditional territory for many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and it continues to be home for many other diverse nations and newcomers as well. So I'm grateful to be here today. Um, First, I will give you a bit of an introduction. Sorry, we'll start with the agenda. So welcome and introduction, and then I'll give you a bit about ARI, a summary about ARI program and our activities, and we will be hearing from our key speakers. I'll introduce them in a second, and we'll have some time for Q&A, and we will wrap up. So ARI, Allies and Refugees Integration, is a program by OCASI that started in 2018 in partnership with Refugee 613. We saw that the settlement professionals and sponsors are natural allies with a common goal of providing the best support to sponsored refugees. But there are gaps in the sector that leads to communication issues and difficulties. It makes collaboration difficult, and that's the problem that we wanted to address. So the first round of ARI was more about researching and understanding the issue better, and designing pilot ideas to be tested, including the knowledge exchange and intentional connections pilots that we started in 2020. In 2021, a new round of ARI was funded by IRCC until 2025, and in this round we're focusing on two main activities: the knowledge exchange, which is a series of virtual webinars and roundtables like this one, that aims to bring people together, people of the stakeholders in the sector, in the settlement sector, and sponsor communities and sponsorship agreement holders to share their knowledge and experience and build common understanding and collaboration. And the second is the ambassador agencies activity, in which we support sponsorship agreement holders and service provider organizations to partner together and implement elements of ARI's best practices and successful activities, and continue to learn and share tools together in order to also, like I said, improve the support for private sponsored refugees. So that's very much ARI's work. For more information, you can contact me on my email. I'll leave my email in the chat box. And moving on to today's webinar. So today we were going to talk about the private sponsorship of LGBTQIA+ refugees. We're going to talk about their backgrounds, where they come from, the issues they face, the asylum seeking process, the private sponsorship application process, and what kind of challenges and difficulties they carry. And also, after arriving in Canada, the settlement and services that are particular to LGBTQIA+ community, and the things that they require, in comparison to other refugees, the major difficulties, challenges, and gaps, and how we can improve also. That's a big element, whether workers in the sector, private sponsors, how we can collaborate more together to better support newcomers. So today we have our key speakers, Paige McLean from Rainbow Railroad and Martha Jennings from the 519, and Bill Crossan, who is an independent private sponsor. Paige will start. Paige is the Complementary Pathways Program Officer at Rainbow Railroad. She joined the Rainbow Railroad team as an intern in January 2020 and completed a bachelor in social work. And she has a background in various roles supporting newcomers and supporting child development and other social work and activism. So I will leave the floor for you, Paige. Do you want to share your presentation now?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so I'll stop sharing and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Can folks see that okay?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Hi. So like Yazan mentioned, my name is Paige McLean. My pronouns are she, her. I am the program officer at Rainbow Railroad focused on complementary pathways. This is a bit of lingo for just basically I am a caseworker that mostly works on our private sponsorship of refugees casework. So I'm going to start off with just a bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start by talking about Rainbow Railroad's work as a whole, just in case some folks aren't familiar with it. I'll then hone in specifically on our PSR program. I'm going to also talk a bit about why LGBTQI+ people flee and sort of information and context in certain countries of origin and the challenges they face in that second country that they flee to, which is the country of asylum. I'll then talk about the PSR application process, and then I will briefly skim over challenges in the host country and a success story as well, just because I think Bill is going to speak a little more to that than I will. So starting off with Rainbow Railroad's work. So Rainbow Railroad is a not-for-profit aimed at supporting LGBTQI+ people across the world. We work in multiple regions to help LGBTQI+ people who, due to their due to their gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, or sex characteristics, are facing oppression and persecution at the hands of their government and of the public. We offer an entire suite of programs in order to support folks on their journeys, and private sponsorship is just one of these programs. And our main program is our emergency travel support program. So last year, we were able to relocate over 400 LGBTQI+ people to safer countries through the emergency travel support program. This was a huge number for us. And the bulk of that number, about 250 folks, were relocated due to the Afghanistan crisis. So now moving into our work in the PSR context specifically. So we are able to select 10 cases per year for the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership. And there are some barriers to supporting more than 10 cases. And these barriers include the complicated, extensive nature of the PSR application. So they're very detailed. They require a very significant legal lens to complete. There's the extensive wait times overseas, which Rainbow Railroad supports applicants during, both with financial support, as the majority of refugees don't have the legal right to work, and with emotional and mental health support as well. These cases also entail the recruitment, coordination, and retention of about 5 to 7 volunteers per case selected. So that times 10 cases per year, as you can imagine, kind of builds up. And like I mentioned at the top, those limited spaces under the RRAP program. So those 10 slots per year. So now jumping into why LGBTQI+ people flee specifically. So there are, of course, situations and conditions that affect all people around the globe for why they flee, such as widespread violence, war, climate crisis is becoming a big one, and persecution as well. And then there are, of course, those situations and conditions that can either compound those others or that are specific to LGBTQI+ people, such as family rejection, being outed in the community or media, LGBTQI specific persecution, things like that, discrimination based on who they are. And yeah, and then of those eligible for PSR, most commonly Rainbow Railroad sees Iranians and Ugandans seeking asylum. And that has to do with various laws in those countries. So for example, honor killings are still permitted by law in Iran, where family members can harm LGBTQI plus family members and legally get away with it, essentially. And in Uganda specifically, it was our third highest request for help country, only behind Afghanistan and Jamaica. And that is due to their penal code has a section on unnatural offenses, which is like constantly widely interpreted to include members of the LGBTQI community. So they've lived through those conditions and then they flee to a second country. And this is some of what we see there. So on a general level, we see things like discrimination. We see issues with identity documents. This is particularly present with trans individuals. Their identity might not match their appearance always and how they identify, and challenges securing support as well. So again, like I mentioned, the majority of these folks are Iranians who then flee to Turkey, or Ugandans who then flee to Kenya. So in terms of Iranians fleeing to Turkey, Turkey has a very large refugee population, and unfortunately, there's been growing hostility towards the refugee population as well. And in terms of Ugandans fleeing to Kenya, there's a massive bottleneck, a huge backlog of folks in the Kakuma refugee camp. There's a specific section of that camp that's supposed to be LGBTQI plus friendly and protected, but unfortunately that ends up not being the case. And I also wanted to talk about too, Rainbow Railroad did a collaborative report with the Organization for Refuge, Asylum, and Migration. And that report asked folks in the Kakuma refugee camp kind of about their experience there and why they fled and different things like that. And they noted that over 90% of the respondents of this survey in the report have been verbally assaulted in the camp. 83% reported being denied services, and 45% reported having to have relocated out of this supposed LGBTQI friendly camp. So yeah, that's some unfortunate context in the two regions I would say that we work in the most when supporting folks in this program. So next, I'm going to talk a bit about the application process. So this is theoretically of all of those folks that are waiting, Rainbow Railroad gets to select 10 cases and what happens next. So unfortunately, the private sponsorship of refugee application process can be very re-traumatizing. So they're asked about their past, everywhere that they've lived for the past 10 years, down to like the year and month of like every traumatic event they've experienced. And so it's a really tough situation for them. And then you're asking them to relive it all on the forms, right? The process is also not very trans inclusive. So folks have to be submitted under their legal name and their legal sex. Fortunately, we submit the applications via email, and therefore we can do some kind of, this is their legal name, but this is the name that we want you to refer to them as. And I've just a note here, like one form of all the forms has another gender checkbox, but unfortunately that's about the extent of it. And lastly, there's a lot of issues of access overseas, such as technology. These forms are lengthy and complicated, and they're in locked PDFs. They can't be completed on a phone, and that's what the majority of the folks in refugee camps only have access to. Access to their own documentation. So of course, many folks flee that first country with nothing, not even their ID documents in some cases. Language support is of course an issue. IRCC only accepts the forms in English or French, and those are not the first language of many fleeing. And legal support, of course, like I mentioned, due to the nature of the forms. And we do our best to support with these different aspects, but that's all we can do, right, is our best. And so we try, but it's hard. And so I wanted to talk a little bit too about the challenges in the host country. Most do really well here, but there are, of course, challenges that come. So the first one being, of course, the rising costs of living, and I'll kind of lump that in with housing too, because both of those things are getting very, very expensive, particularly for those that are in Toronto. For context, Rainbow Railroad's social or sponsorship agreement holder rather is in Toronto, and therefore we can only relocate folks here, and that gets really tough when the costs are so high. Similarly to before, language barriers are a huge issue. The interpretation services are available, but they're often hard to come by for free or low cost. And then lastly, of course, mental health is a huge aspect, right? They've fled two countries. They have quite they often have quite a past experience with trauma. And again, services are available, but they're often hard to come by for free or low cost, and particularly those that take non-Westernized and culturally relevant approaches. So folks generally are doing better here, but there are still challenges as well, of course. And lastly, I did want to share with you folks a success story. So this is an individual that has permitted me to share their story here. He did give me permission to use his name, but just in case, I'm keeping it out. So this is a cisgender gay man from Syria. He uses he, him pronouns. He's been in Canada for about 5 years through the help of Rainbow Railroad. And he wrote to me about how homosexuality is punished by law in Syria. And so when he was there, he had to live in hiding. And just a quote that I pulled from his story that I thought was really impactful was, "It's been really good resettling. From the moment I got to the airport in Toronto, I felt like home already. I was able to finally start my journey of self-discovery." And lastly, we're going to have time for questions at the end, but feel free to write down that email address if you have any other questions after the session.
Thank you so much, Paige. That's great. And thank you for sharing the all this information. I have a question, but I will keep it to later. Just give me a second to go back to my presentation. All right, do you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So now we're gonna move to Martha Singh Jennings of the 519. She's the director of Housing, Advocacy and Support Services at the 519. Martha has been working in solidarity with marginalized communities for over a decade in Canada and UK and internationally, with particular focus on women, trans and non-binary persons and those experiencing displacement and racialization. Martha was interim director of LGBTQIA plus refugee programs at the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto, MCC. And she also worked as the program manager at Rainbow Railroad and was one of the team members that collaborated with the 519 on a government assisted refugee partnership. Thank you again, Martha, for joining, and I will leave the floor to you. Do you want to share your screen?
I don't think I need to actually, but I'm happy to share share it if there is specific things people want a little bit more detail about.
Sure.
Thank you, Yazan. Thanks for having me today. Hi, everyone. As Yazan said, my name is Martha. I use they, them, she, her pronouns, and I've been working with the 519 Community Centre in Toronto for about 2 years now. As you can tell from that intro, I've kind of like moved through several organizations that are connected to private sponsorship. The 519 as a City of Toronto agency doesn't engage in private sponsorship directly, but how we do support privately sponsored folks is by providing services. So we have funding from the province of Ontario, and also IRCC, so federal funding, to provide services and programming to LGBTQ plus refugees and newcomers. And that is the way in which we can best support your work as folks who are in the community and networks of privately sponsored people. As you might know, as you might guess from how I described how we're funded, folks who are privately sponsored are eligible for our services because they are IRCC supported newcomers with a refugee background. So how do we support those folks? As I said, there's services. We have several coordinators whose role is varied, but one of the ways in which they support LGBTQ newcomers is to provide one-to-one services. So just as you as Circles of Hope, sponsorship teams, settlement teams, however you describe the context of your teamwork in your organization, the kinds of support that you might provide in terms of like kind of detailed application writing and support like that, that's the sort of stuff we can help with. And one of the beautiful things about private sponsorship, one of the reasons why sessions like this promote it and offer ways in which you can do it well, is because it leads to much more successful settlement outcomes typically than folks who are sponsored through government assisted refugees, or folks who are coming through, oftentimes folks who are coming through refugee claimant pathways as well, like inland claiming protection. And the reason that is, maybe obvious to some of you, that folks are coming with a pre-made social network, a pre-built group of people who know about them, are expecting them, are readying themselves to provide support, getting to know that person, connecting them in terms of services, but also socially with spaces and places that can build out that that support system that we all need to live strong and good lives. So it's wonderful that private sponsorship teams are able to do that for refugees of all kinds, and obviously in this context, the context of this conversation, LGBTQ plus refugees. So the way in which we can support you in doing that is, one, providing one-to-one services to take some of the like nitty-gritty, stressful forms stuff that people need to do off your hands, by our coordinators providing that kind of support. And that support can be provided in person. So if the person is in the GTA, they can come in and see us to receive that support. If they are anywhere in Ontario, they can access that support through via phone or via virtual, like video conferencing system, whichever they're able to access. So if that would give your teams a little bit more breathing room to do some of the more like personal, human connection type stuff that is so important to private sponsorship, we can help you with that by taking some of the like slightly boring paperwork side of things off your hands. So please do connect with us for that kind of support. As I said, can be delivered in a range of formats. So it doesn't matter if the person isn't in Toronto, we can still provide them with support if they're somewhere in Ontario. Unfortunately, we can't provide support outside of Ontario just because, as you know, systems differ province to province. So we know about Ontario systems, we don't know about other systems. And then the second way in which our newcomer teams can provide support to the privately sponsored folks that you work with is, again, private sponsorship works because of the social space and the networks and the feeling supported by other human beings being physically around and available. We have spaces like that. So you can also connect people to the programs and spaces that we have.
I got a link from Yazan. I sent it to you by email.
Okay, someone just talking there. We have all different kinds of spaces. Some of those are specifically for LGBTQ newcomers. So for example, we have several groups running at the moment that provide social space and information and resources to potentially privately sponsored folks. One is called Henna Hangs. It's for people from Southwest Asia and North Africa. That alternates between in-person and online. So again, someone's in the GTA, they can come in person, they can eat food with us, get to meet some of their potential peers and maybe future friends, future roommates even, to build out those networks even further beyond the settlement team that you have built, or the circles of hope that you build. But then also that is offered, it alternates between in-person and online. So even folks who are outside of the GTA can connect with that space and provide some of that that support, that peer networks that they should hopefully be developing to live a full and contented life here in Toronto or Ontario. So yeah, Henna Hangs is one, Queer Muslim Community Circle is another, Black Youth Gathering is another. But then the 519 is a big and broad organization. Yes, we have a very robust newcomer team, but we have loads of different services. So there's programs for children and families. So if anyone you're sponsoring has young people in their life, in their sphere, then there's support there for caregivers and for young people, families, 2S LGBTQ families. There's a really robust community engaged food program that provides meal support. As Paige was mentioning, Toronto is damned expensive. So if one of your folks that you're supporting is able to get to us, they can sign up for our frozen meal programs where they'll get some help with covering those costs of feeding themselves. A nutritious range of meals are available. We have a big and growing access to justice, like legal initiatives department. So if there's like kind of a complex thing happening for someone you're supporting that maybe they could do with some guidance around, we can help with that. And we're also going to be doing things like Know Your Rights as a Tenant session or Rent Smart. So we can also help support you by providing information spaces for the people that you're supporting to learn about how to be actively engaged and advocate for oneself in all of the many bureaucracies that exist where we have to live. So that's just a few examples, but there are many. Some of them much more social, like our Trans People of Colour programming and our Meal Trans programming. Some are much more informative and services-based, like our Legal Initiatives programming and our annual tax clinic. So there's many, many things. So again, to reiterate, the way we can support you, and I encourage you to reach out to other settlement agencies in your area, because privately sponsored individuals are eligible to access settlement agency support. So if you're not close to us, and you or the folks that you support would like to access services in person, there should be somewhere local to you that you can do that through, like a government-funded settlement agency, to, again, take some of that admin off of your hands and also help the individual that you're sponsoring to build out their settlement networks beyond you. So they're spreading and widening their resources. And as we know, social connection, human connection is so very vital to feeling grounded, to feeling connected, to healing, to establishing a robust world around you that supports well-being in so many different ways. So really do encourage you to do that, either through us in person or virtually, or through a settlement agency that is local to you, where you can access those services in person as well. Did you want me to talk about anything else, Yazan? Does anybody want specific info about anything that I mentioned in my ramble there? I've got a hand raised by Zach.
Hi there. I just want to ask a question. I heard you mention about food support, nutritious meal that offered. I work in Niagara region, Niagara Folk Arts Multicultural Center. We have some refugee claimants made the case based on their gender, sexual orientation, but it's not privately sponsored. And now they're living in a hotel in Niagara Falls. For example, I have one specific client is having a food issues. The hotel do feed them, but this client is diabetic, and then the hotel doesn't offer any accommodations to this specific case. So the food is not doing anything good for this client. I have been trying to find some additional resources, but the resources is very limited. Also, they live in a hotel, they don't have a place to cook, right? So I'm just wondering, in terms of this, if there are any support or any resources that I can take or somehow help this client, or the 519 can offer any help. Thank you.
So to clarify, this person is in Niagara region in a hotel and is a refugee claimant.
Yes.
Well, they're certainly very welcome to access our services as a refugee claimant. We have specific programming for refugee claimants. That includes, when you come in person, that includes nutritious food. So our meals program is a frozen meals program. So if you don't have the means to heat through food, it wouldn't be appropriate for somebody. What I might suggest to you is if they've already registered, if they already have their claimant ID or their acknowledgement that they've submitted a claim, I would discuss with their Ontario Works caseworker about the funding that they receive for their upkeep. So there's like different portions, right? There's a shelter, and then there's money that people receive for food and bills and stuff like that. So I would encourage them, and maybe you can support them in doing this, connecting with their caseworker to make a plan around how to address that. I'm not certain that would follow through to anything, but that would be on my initial port of call in that situation. And then I also think, given that it's Niagara, you probably want to also look. I imagine this is the case there, although I don't work in that region, so I'm not 100%. But there are quite a few organizations, and they are certainly oversubscribed. But there are quite a few organizations in Toronto that have regular, sometimes daily meals provided, so people can go and sit and eat something in often they're in church spaces or like kind of related to food banks. So that would be my suggestion to you. It's a very specific question, so I don't really want to talk too much in detail in this context about it. But I'll send you a note in the chat as well.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
All right. Any other questions to Martha before we can move on? Okay, I'm gonna share my screen again, and we're gonna move to our next key speaker, who's Bill Crossan, who's a private sponsor of LGBTQIA plus refugees. Bill and his partner Don McCulloch have been independently involved with private sponsorship of LGBTQIA plus refugees to Canada for over 4 years. As a couple that identifies as an LGBTQIA plus, their focus is mainly on the community and recognizing the queer and trans people face more complicated challenges as refugees. Since 2018, they have opened their home to several newcomers and anticipate that it will be home to others yet to come as well. Bill and Don have constituent group status with MCC Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto, and Bill also serves as a board member for ANZUP Canada and one of the private refugee sponsorship network, where he also chairs the Knowledge Exchange Committee. Thank you a lot, Bill, for joining us today, and yeah, the floor is yours. I'll just close my screen.
Thanks, Yazin, and thanks, Paige, and thanks, Martha. Great introductions to this discussion. As Yazin had said, we've been involved. My partner Don and I have been involved for about 4 years. I guess that means we're kind of seasoned by now. But I have to say, we were introduced to this world by a lovely young Syrian couple who had recently arrived from Turkey. I think that was in 2018. And we actually met them through couch surfing, of all things. But I mean, it was our introduction to this. We have chosen to focus our attention on queer newcomers and refugees. We feel that there is more complication in terms of the circumstances that they have experienced and continue to experience even after they get here. I think Martha had also drawn reference to this. We're also, in addition to being sponsors, we try to support people who are government assisted refugees because they don't have that human connection prior to coming here. And it makes a huge difference. We've welcomed a number of different people here who have struggled much more because they don't have those connections made. I also would like to show my appreciation for the 519 and Rainbow Road for all the work that they do and the assistance that they offer. I think that is very helpful and very much needed in terms of this space. I was asked to respond to several questions about queer refugees and how they differ from other refugees, challenges they face, whether the supports are enough, where there are gaps and so on, and then mental health challenges in particular. For clarity, I'm not a mental health professional, so any comments I make are observational only. So I'm not a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a social worker, and so on. I have to say that in the last 18 months or so, our experience has led us over a really steep learning curve because we were relatively naive coming into this, what was really necessary to be involved in this work. And I also understand that there have been some disruptions based on COVID, since the early part of 2020, which has changed the landscape, I think, a lot, added some really significant additional pressures in terms of providing support for people, both before they arrived, because those periods were extended a lot, and then since they've arrived, because services, I think, still haven't gotten back to what they may have been normally before. And I'm not long enough into this work to know exactly what they look like before. I think to refer to something that Paige had mentioned earlier about success stories, I wasn't really prepared to talk specifically about success stories, but one thing I would like to say is there's the shiny refugee, the one that normally gets presented, and those are good, they're inspiring. There are a lot more, I think, stories and examples of people who struggle a lot more and require enormous amounts of help and support in order to be able to settle and settle well. I think typically the successful economic immigrant is kind of the prototype that's been put forward to describe how well the programs offer. And I am very grateful to the Government of Canada for offering private sponsorship for over 40 years. I think we are pretty unique and well advanced in that regard in the world. So in terms of queer refugees and newcomers, I think about their experiences being layered. All refugees suffer significant levels of displacement, stress, physical, psychological injury, alienation, and trauma based on circumstances that they've endured for years, without exception. I think that's true of everyone. I don't want to compare different people's levels of hardship and trauma because everybody experiences those in different ways. Queer people, queer refugees may experience the same type or probably do experience the same kinds of issues as non-queer people. But in addition, we are also experiencing, people who come from different parts of the world where there are significant challenges being queer experience additional layers of that. They are not safe in their own communities. They cannot necessarily find support from their family, friends, or communities. So in addition to the things that everybody else is experiencing, they have these additional layers on top of that. Non-queer people can rely on family, friends, and community. Sometimes these are actually the source of some of their injury and trauma, significantly the case. And racism and queer phobia also exists here as well. So it's not just before you leave, it's after you get here. And we have had some experience with people who have arrived, who have experienced this directly once they've arrived in Toronto. It's shocking for them, and it's disturbing for us to hear and know about this. We sometimes feel we live in a bubble and that things are safe and wonderful. That's not always the case. As sponsors, and this was mentioned, I think, by Martha as well, and maybe by Paige, we try to communicate with people that we sponsor well in advance of them arriving here, almost from the time that we identify them or they identify us. And we've had both situations where we've gone to people or they've come to us to seek sponsorship. We try and communicate with them as much as possible before. That allows an opening of a communication between them. We get to know them, they get to know us. It builds a sense of trust. It also gives them a sense that someone gives a damn about who they are and what they've gone through. And that seems fairly basic, but it often doesn't happen. We try and find out little things about them, like birthdays, favorite colors, favorite foods. Those seem like little things, but to them it's not. So when we set up a phone call with them through one of the social media platforms to celebrate their birthday, they are often really touched by that, and it makes quite a difference in their lives. In terms of challenges, there are numerous challenges, both for queer and non-queer people. The layers of stress, as I say, are probably more extensive for queer people than they are for others. I remember hearing this story. There's a Syrian author. We went to hear his book launch 2 or 3 years ago. I've forgotten now. It's often been described, or has been described, that the arrival of someone in Canada is sort of like a Disney movie. There's an image of the plane that's about to land. Music swells, it's very inspirational, and all of the troubles from the past disappear. It isn't the case. I mean, there are as many, perhaps not as difficult, but as many challenges once they arrive as before they arrived. They may not be in mortal danger the same way, but there's still significant challenges. There's probably an initial sense of euphoria when somebody arrives, often fatigue, because it sometimes takes them 2 days to arrive. We know someone who took more than 2 days in 4 different flights from the Far East. By the time they get here, they are so tired, they don't know what's happening. So it takes some time for them to actually settle in from the initial euphoria, and then sometimes things surface after that they've been holding in for years. Many of the challenges are bureaucratic, starts from IRCC, and I know that there was a description of the forms that are page. You had gone through what the forms are like for doing private sponsorship. They're awful, but you have to do them. There's no way around that, and it does take a significant amount of time, given the technology and language and so on, understanding of what's being asked. Usual things that happen when people arrive, setting up cell service, banking, getting OHIP cards, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all routine things. They're the same challenges everybody else has. Finding a place to live, that was also mentioned. It's incredibly expensive in Toronto, and there's almost no place to live. So that's difficult. What's different for people who I think are LGBTQ plus is that the access to it, even the spaces that are available, becomes somewhat more challenging, because sometimes people just don't want to rent to queer people. You don't generally get a lot of lead time. When someone is about to arrive, they can tell you in sometimes as little as 2 weeks, although it could be months. But even that, because there never is 100% communication with the authorities about when that's going to happen. So it leaves you in limbo and have to scramble at the last minute. It's even worse for GARs, because they usually end up being assigned to a settlement agency and put into common spaces with other people who have just arrived. The people who are there may also hold the same kinds of prejudices, and often will demonstrate to queer people who are in there their displeasure with them, and sometimes that's threatening. And we've come across a few people who have come into that kind of situation. What else have we got? Sharing accommodation is almost a prerequisite these days because of the cost. People don't necessarily want to share with queer people. One thing that is, and it took us a while to find out, was that Facebook and other social media platforms have access to like queer homes for queers, so you can find people where that space is safer. It still has the same kinds of challenges about expense and limited access to them. One of the things that we have struggled with over the last couple of years especially, and I think that's partly pandemic related, but it's also been a general trend in Ontario, is finding primary care practitioners. Without exception, I would say that anyone who arrives is in need of medical assistance at some level for a variety of different things. And primary care practitioners are the gateway to all of the health support services that are behind those. So if you can't find a GP, you can't get access to a lot of other things. It's particularly important. It's important for queer people in general, but it's particularly important for trans people who need very specialized care and services. And if you cannot get a GP, you cannot get appropriate trans care. And we found that on several occasions that's the case. Add to that a layer of complication related to language, because if somebody's level of English is not strong and they're speaking Arabic or Farsi or some other language, they can't explain to the doctor what it is that they feel, how things are not going right for them, and so on. Finding translation services is also not that easy, especially when you might want to or might have to do it on a fairly short notice. We have found a few, but it's difficult to get them. And the language that's specifically used in medical circumstances is specific. So most translation services don't necessarily have someone who can speak in another language and understand medical terminology to translate well. Mental health supports, it's a nightmare. There isn't enough. It's very expensive. There's bias against mental health service in the first place from culture. Even here, there is bias against mental health needs and issues. In other parts of the world, it's even more difficult to deal with that sort of thing from the person's perspective themselves. IFHP, the Interim Federal Health Program, covers some additional costs for this. But there's another catch-22, because if you can't find a practitioner, a GP, who can make the referral to someone, and that often doesn't happen for months and may happen for a year, interim federal health stops. You don't get extended access to that. So these are all kinds of things that we've encountered over the last couple of years, and they're very real. They're very significant to the people that we've seen. English instruction, I don't know, I have a hard time thinking of it as being anything, the link classes as being anything other than punitive. To say someone you have to go from Monday to Friday, 9 to 2:30 every day to do this is overwhelming for a lot of people. There are some people who have never had extended formalized education, say beyond a primary level. So when they're being forced into this or put into this kind of situation, it's just like they can't handle it. They may also have significant traumas that make it difficult for them to actually have attention to be able to learn language. And they may also be put into a situation where other people from similar cultures who hold the same biases are in those classes, and it makes them feel uncomfortable. I know it's a challenging and a difficult thing. 519 used to offer some language courses, but there were issues and problems around offering that when it had to be open to everyone in the community, even those outside of the LGBTQ community. Without hesitation, I think I would say there is never enough support available. We have routinely felt like we are on our own, I think, for the last couple of years. And I think a lot of that is attributable to the fact that things got shut down a lot during COVID. So there just weren't access or availability to these sources of support that we would have liked or appreciated having. We're getting more and more connected now because those are opening up more to people. But it's also taken us a long time to try and find some. Getting real information from credible sources is hugely a challenge. Again, that starts from IRCC. You can almost never get anything back from IRCC from anywhere. Interim Federal Health is the same way. You can never really, there's a 1,200-page document of a list of practitioners. Before recently, it was not in a searchable, it was a PDF and not searchable. So, that's difficult. And then a lot of it hasn't been updated. People have fallen off from the practitioners identified. You have to go through this manually. Waiting on hold for various services, that goes for Link and some of the other ones. You might be on for hours and then get cut off before you actually talk to someone. That's frustrating and really hard to deal with. Oftentimes we get people handing us pamphlets and links, or the people we are supporting get those things. They don't know what to do with them. Like, they can't necessarily read them. I find it hard to understand how you connect with some of those things. And I mean, I've lived here all my life. So these are just things, the personal connection, I think, is much more valuable than handing somebody a piece of paper. I work in the health system. I've been working in the health system for about 40 years. It's siloed. Social services are siloed. So there isn't a connectedness. It's starting to change, but it's going to take a long time. Systems don't function seamlessly. People's issues are interconnected, and they need those kinds of things connected in order to be able to settle well. Sometimes the services being offered are being offered by people who are not queer friendly. Even in some of the settlement and support agencies, there are people who work there who are not queer friendly. And that's an issue when it comes to queer newcomers. For trans people, protocols for accessing services are even worse. Like, it's harder for them, for example, to find a knowledgeable and trans-sensitive GP. There are very few of them, and they're full up. I mean, regular GPs are all full up. It's hard to find. I already mentioned about Interim Federal Health. You can get some additional services, but they cut off after a year, and it might take you close to a year to actually get connected to someone who's under the IFHP banner. As I say, I am sympathetic to the fact that agencies are underfunded and under-resourced. It's part of the way that the funding models have been set up. Oftentimes, we found a person who was really good, only to find out in a few months their job was on a pilot project or a funded program grant of some sort. That finished, they moved on, we had to start again. I mean, these are the kinds of things that make it very difficult. We think we've found people to help support us, and they've moved on. So we have to start all over again. At the risk of droning on too much longer, I just have a few more comments to make. I had already mentioned that the mental health situation is a nightmare, lack of supply, lack of affordability. And I would like to say that without exception, anyone who arrives as a refugee sponsored or otherwise and has become a newcomer to Canada has experienced trauma, often significant trauma. These are people who should have directly access to medical support. I don't know how that gets implemented or if it might get implemented. Within the first few weeks, you should be able to see a doctor, and you should be able to be referred to mental health supports within the first month, if not sooner, because that's an enormous thing, I think, for setting the stage for success later on in this. Culture and language also play a significant role in how people are able to settle. Family plays an important part, both positive and negative. Oftentimes it's negative, but they can be a strong element of support. There are people who have helped their sons, daughters, sisters, brothers escape from the places that they've been that have put them in danger. And they still provide support for them, emotional and social support, if they are able to. And it's often difficult to reconcile issues of faith and relationships, especially with family and so on. I hope I'm not painting a really discouraging picture of sponsorship. I think it's important to share real concerns about what's involved when you get involved in this kind of thing. For some people, that may mean stepping away from this and not wanting to take it on. I would say that may not be a bad thing, because if you get into it and find that you're really in over your head, or this is not what you want to do, you may leave the person that you're sponsoring in the lurch, and that they would end up having to struggle to find a way to help and support themselves after the fact without anticipating that they need to do that. I believe that there are people who will still feel like they want to be private sponsors. For myself and my partner, we will continue. It takes a lot of energy. It's quite intense, and it's very emotional. I know from our perspective, it's been a very emotional experience, but we think it's important. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That's very eye-opening. We often talk about the good things and the general challenges, but this is certainly going in so much details, and it's eye-opening, like the amount of things, the small details that we don't think of doing our regular work, that queer and trans people, newcomers go through. Yeah, I thank you again so much for this, and I have a couple of questions. First, I wanna, like, I know you're not a professional, Bill, but in terms of mental health and support of mental health, like for newcomers, as for regular, like non practitioners, non-specialized people, like how do we provide that kind of support? Are there any best practices, any recommendations that you found working, or particular things that we need to keep in mind?
It's a tough thing. I mean, we have located one or two, I would say they're therapists. There is the CCBT, they offer some level of this. I mean, there are spotty resources that are accessible to people. I think there may be benefit in trying to develop the capability within the sponsorship community to be able to at least recognize and identify where there are behavioral traits that might cause concern. Again, I'm not going to be speaking as someone who is licensed as a psychologist or whatever, but I mean, I recognize this because it goes beyond just newcomers and so on. There is a dearth of mental health specialists and supports across the province, across the country. So it's not like you're going to be able to magically come up with additional supports in this. I think it's important as a sponsor to watch people who you are sponsoring as much as possible. We're in a bit of a favored position in some respects because we have some people living in our home, but we also don't have people living in our home who we're sponsoring. And it's much more difficult from our perspective to track how they are doing outside of having them say something or someone else that they know say something. But I think as much as possible, if you can manage to keep tabs on people, and I mean, one of the things that we've only recently kind of discovered is we're always focused on specific tasks because there's this 12-month clock that ticks that says at the end of this, you're supposed to have fully viable people entering the Canadian economy, the Canadian society. And it's just like, one, that's not realistic at all. If it's 2 or 3 or 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised. It depends on the individual. But, you know, to keep tabs on people as much as possible to get an understanding of how they look on a day-to-day basis. An improvement in mental health is not linear. You know, there are people who are okay today and tomorrow might go into crisis. CAMH is around. I mean, probably everybody here knows about that, or at least most people do if they're in Toronto. It's just like sometimes you need to use emergency services, and sometimes that happens in the middle of the night. You know, but they do have experts there and programs that support. There's a New Beginnings program and some other programs that are set up, and I think those are specifically, at least 1 or 2 of them are specifically for newcomers. That was long-winded.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to also ask you, how long do you estimate? Like, obviously 1 year is not realistic. So like, what is the realistic period of settlement for
More. I mean, that really is an individual thing. I think there are some people that I can think of 1 or 2 that, you know, within 12 months, they were fine. Mostly. I don't think you can ever say exactly that when someone has been here for 12 months and they seem to be functioning okay, that they are in fact functioning okay, but they seem to be, you know, they're not in crisis like other people are in crisis, but it's so hard to say, you know, it will take 2 years or 3 years. I think, I mean, I can think of some people where 3 or 4 years, maybe even 5 years, still show signs that there may be problems with settling. Sorry, Martha.
Oh, no need to apologize. I just wanted to follow on from what you're saying. So yeah, totally agree that it is definitely not 1 year for the vast majority of people. I would say more like 3 or 5 years for the majority of people. In terms of, as Bill was saying, we know that mental health supports are lacking across the board. And I think that with that list of to-dos, that checklist, those tasks that settlement teams create, I think there's often a tendency in teams, because it's easier in a sense. I mean, it depends who you are, I guess, but it's a little bit easier to think about the kind of like practical, get an OHIP card, talk about how to do your taxes, connect with this person. Those are kind of like very defined tasks in a sense. And some of the stuff that from my experience gets a little bit more lost is the social element of connecting. And whilst those are not in any way going to replace or like serve the purpose of accessing like formal mental health support, like ongoing, specifically mental health focused supports, we're all we're all humans, and we all need connection to be well. And the majority of people that we're likely to be sponsoring are coming from collectivist cultures, and being extremely isolated, as typically newcomers are, and specifically LGBTQ newcomers are. I think having including in your tasks, your to-do, your settlement plan, social stuff, it sometimes goes a little bit less focused on because it's not so clear. And it's also sometimes hard for people to be, as they're like unraveling and unpicking kind of the way they maybe have been like hiding themselves and being very socially restricted in their country of first asylum, might also be hard to like remember the things that they might like to do. And that those kind of remembrances can be pulled out in those social spaces as well. So you're, as a team, you're creating social spaces for somebody, and you're not like explicitly asking somebody like, oh, hey, what did you do for fun back when you were 11 or whatever? But you're sitting around and you're sharing stories, which is also part of like healing from culture shock and dealing with culture shock. Is sitting around and talking, sharing stories and remembrances and thinking about who we are in a broader sense. And then trying to find ways to help someone meet those like maybe creative or social or like self-reflective practices that not all of us, but most of us have little things in our histories, in our ways of being, that have like provided self-reflection space or healing space or calm or soothing to us. Sometimes they're social, sometimes they're creative, whatever. And finding those little ways. So I'm remembering an example from a conference I went to, in a workshop with someone who was a mental health professional. I also am not, talking about an individual who was not able, given the health coverage that they had, to access formal mental health supports. But through kind of like less formal conversation, they together remembered or like understood that this individual loved cycling. So they figured out getting this person a bike, which became their mode of transport, which like also helped with their financial resources, because they're paying a little less for their transportation. Obviously gave them exercise. It reminded them of being a young person and cycling around with their wind in their hair, and it brought them a little bit of joy. And again, not a replacement, not a solve for it, but just trying to like kind of think about the social determinants of health more broadly. So yes, obviously housing is a huge issue that we do not here have the answers to, because it's massive, and mental health is a huge issue. But there are, in the meantime, while we're advocating for those supports to be built out and to actually serve their purpose, there are kind of little more kind of person-to-person things that we can start to like eke out and think about that are a bit broader in terms of our worlds, our emotional and social worlds. And I know, Bill, you and Don do beautiful like kind of dinners and have traditions. Those sorts of things are super important as human beings, to have traditions, to have a social network, to have people to share with, to have, like I said, most folks who are being sponsored are coming from collectivist cultures. So coming into a pretty individualist culture and not having those spaces also can really like keep people in the shell that they often have developed to protect themselves, when really what we wanted to be doing is like providing some space where they can start to unfurl and relax a little bit.
Thank you a lot, Martha, and thank you, Bill. And there's another question that I thought of. I wanted to follow up on what Paige was talking about. Same thing with the emotional and mental health support for non-professionals, but for people who are still living in transition countries, and if providing emotional and mental health support is difficult here, so I imagine it's much more difficult. So what worked for you? What has been working for you in Rainbow Railroad?
Yeah, so two main things. We are starting to work on fleshing out like a mental health support team. These aren't professionals or psychotherapists, but we just call it kind of like a peer-to-peer support program. Right now it's an individual and a volunteer, but as our organization continues to grow, we're looking to flesh that out. And then the second thing that we do also as an organization that is based in Canada and the US, we don't have physical presence in any of those other countries. And therefore, one thing that we do a lot is rely a lot on different partner organizations that are on the ground. And so we're able to often fund those organizations and support them, but without actually being physically on the ground there. And yeah, those are the two main things that we're able to do to support folks that are in those first or second countries.
Awesome, thank you. And I don't know if do you want to add, Bill, on that also, like in terms of or just like in your experience also, and I think you mentioned that, but if you want to add anything about working with people before they arrive here, what has been working or what has been, I'm not gonna ask what has been the most challenging.
I think
what has been successful only.
I think the piece about trying to, like, as a sponsor, thinking about this from the sponsorship perspective, I think the idea about establishing a relationship with people before they arrive is pretty powerful. I can think of one circumstance in particular, actually two, anyway, maybe three, where the person explicitly said, this helped me get through, because I think they did feel the sense of isolation where they were, without having, you know, much or any real contact with, and in some places, there are communities of expat people that have come from, you know, whichever country, Afghanistan or Iran or wherever, that there are camps, there are non-camps, you're sometimes sort of diffused into, like in Istanbul, there are lots of people who are, you know, Syrians displaced, and in other communities and so on. You can sometimes generate a measure of normalcy in those communities, although even that's limited because queer people are often targeted and identified in the places they seek refuge and so on. But I think the idea that the person who is waiting to come starts to know people that they will expect to meet when they get here is a huge benefit to them, both in the time that they're waiting, but also after they arrive.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have, and I want to give time to people to ask questions if you have anything to add or comment. We have, I think, 15 minutes now for Q&A.
Hi.
Yes, hi.
My name is Laura Gold. I'm from JIAS Toronto. For those who don't know, we are a settlement agency and a SAW. And I just wanted to thank the presenters. I did miss the first part due to my own technical issues, but I'll definitely watch the recording for what I missed. But I wanted to thank the presenters for this. This was really interesting and informative, and I'm really glad we're kind of focusing on this, the particular needs of this subset of PSRs. And you know, we've worked at JIAS with a lot of PSRs over the years, but we really want to make sure that we are doing our best to be as welcoming and inclusive to, the queer community as we can be. And so, webinars like this are really helpful for that. And yeah, so I just wanted to say that and say thank you and introduce myself since I was late.
Thank you so much, Laura. And Bill, I have a question. We have a question on the chat from Sarah C. What can settlement workers do with sponsors to better support the refugee?
I was just about to actually respond in chat, but I think one of the things is we haven't had connection to settlement agencies that have been very, well, in most cases probably have been non-existent. Again, I think in part because there's been COVID and those services have shut down or retracted substantially over the last couple of years, 3 years, whatever. I think they're starting to open up and mobilize more. I think, I'm not sure what the best avenue for this is, but somehow to have information made available to sponsors about the kinds of organizations that are available. Even having, I don't know, I'm a statistician by trade, and thinking analytically and so on is like having a list of things and then the different kinds of things, almost a spreadsheet type of thing to say, okay, this is what this agency does, this is their strengths, these are the communities that they tend to work with more often. I'm not sure that's the best way either. The needs for any individual person who has arrived will vary, both in terms of breadth, but also in terms of timing and so on, and in terms of depth of what they need. I'm not sure if that's answering your question directly, but it's kind of a hard question to give a blanket answer to. But reach out to me, and we can talk more. I don't know whether people have access to email addresses or through Yazin.
I will put all your emails in the chat box if you don't have a problem for people.
I'm fine.
Okay. Another question from Gary. Is there a list of queer-friendly settlement agencies for our group? It's been word of mouth. And also someone, I think Igon asked if there are any online tools and resources for settlement agencies. Martha or Paige, if you have anything you can share with us. And Zach asked if there will be any certificate or proof of participation for this event. Well, we will share the recording, but no, there's no certificate for participation. So yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting. So resources and queer-friendly settlement agencies.
Paige has put a link to RSTP in the chat, which is the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. It's a really, really good tool for folks who are thinking about sponsoring and settlement agencies. There are lots of trainings on there. You can call their staff to ask specific questions, and they're very helpful. There's also, if you connect with your SAR, your sponsorship agreement holder, if you're doing sponsorship, they often also will provide training and resources. So it depends a little bit. I would kind of want to know a little bit more what Igan was, what kind of tools and resources you were thinking. I wonder if you could tell us so we could be a bit more specific.
Maybe to respond to Gary's question about list of queer-friendly settlement agencies.
Yeah, Friday. Yeah, this upcoming Friday.
From our experience, the list is probably really small. I don't think there is a huge number of agencies that are specifically targeted for queer. I would say that we have had a fair amount of luck with ASAP in Toronto. That's the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Protection or Prevention, rather. they do seem to be moving a bit more into settlement services, or we've made avail of services they've had. One, because they have language capable people. So there's people who speak Farsi, people who speak Turkish, I think people who speak Arabic. There may be a couple of other languages in Africa that they are capable of functioning in, but they've been quite helpful to us on a number of occasions. And referred us on to other organizations. Madison Community Services is one of the sort of second level services that we have been able to contact. I'm not going to give the person's name, but I've been really, really happy with one person that works for Madison.
So yes, to turn and follow on from that, Bill, there are, particularly in Toronto, quite a few kind of demographic specific settlement agencies. So ASAP is one, Black Cap is another. There's also the ACAS as well, which is Black Cap is for Black identified folks. ACAS is for Asian, more kind of like East Asian, more so individuals, and they grew out of the kind of grassroots community response to HIV/AIDS, and those organizations have grown and developed settlement portions of their programming, as a lot of folks who are come into the country are affected by HIV/AIDS, and many people actually discover that they are POS when they go through their immigration medical stuff. So very, very important resource. In terms of like kind of mainstream settlement agencies, I mean, I should also say the 519. In terms of mainstream settlement agencies who aren't specifically providing services to us LGBTQ people in the first place, most of them are big enough that it really doesn't matter what the agency says. It's more about the individual person. So I would say if you're trying to connect with the local settlement agency, and this is very relevant to the point I made earlier, if you're trying to connect with your local settlement agency, it is very, very important and valuable to do the work of connecting with them before you connect the sponsored person that you're supporting with them. So reaching out, figuring out who would be the most appropriate person to connect with, and asking a couple of vetting questions to determine whether you personally think this person like meets the bar of being to LGBTQI inclusive and competent in their work. And if for some reason that you need to depend on the support of a settlement agency and you haven't been sufficiently convinced that they will provide sensitive support, just go, just be there, just say, just like with the person's permission, obviously with the sponsor's person's permission, but be a buffer and be the person that's like, that's not an okay question. You don't get to know that. And just be there and be their advocate obviously with their permission in that space if they do have to utilize those resources without someone who's like pre-vetted and doing a good job.
Thank you, Martha. Any more questions? Anyone? We have.
I think Aigan was going to unmute to let us know specifically what kind of resources they were hoping for.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I missed the first part of the webinar because of technical issues. So yes, I was wondering if there are any resources available for settlement agencies, to have more queer-friendly agents who would serve this community. So now I see the list of all these organizations. So I checked the first one that was there, but it was very general. It wasn't just specifically for this community. But I'm also going to check all the others, and I hope I will find the materials that would help us.
If he was here, it's different.
Yeah. That's the thing.
Okay. Thank you, Aigan. And yeah, again, the recording of the webinar will be available to everyone. So apologies for everyone who missed it. And yeah, I'll be sure to send it. Also, OCASI has a positive spaces initiative program that constantly provide resources, training, online virtual training courses that you can take as social workers in the field. They have a wealth of knowledge as well, so you're welcome to check. I just put the link also. Sarah says I'm a settlement worker from, oh, okay. That's just a introductional question. All right. Does the recording include the chat? No, unfortunately. But I will actually, yeah, I will copy the resources I shared, all the links and emails, and I will make sure to share them as well. So yeah, don't worry. Thank you. All right. Well, if that is everything, I think we're done. Thank you so much. We can conclude again. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Martha. I'm really glad. I really appreciate all the information and knowledge that you've given us today. And thank you everyone for attending. And I look forward to see you again.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Yazan.
Thanks so
Take
much.
care.
Thanks, everybody.